All right. All right, fantastic. We're going to go ahead and get started, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Again, my name is Kim Gaji Alexander. I'm one of the directors at Bethesda Green. We are a nonprofit based in Bethesda, Maryland. And the Let's Talk Nuclear is part of our sustainability series. We hold these workshops about once a month. Depending on the topic that we have. So we're going to talk nuclear today, which is fantastic. We've actually never had a workshop on this topic before. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. A couple of housekeeping items. We are going to be using the chat function for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll read it out during the question and answer portion of the workshop, which will be closer to the end. And we're going to hear from our presenters first. So we do have some folks on the call who have little to no understanding of what nuclear is. So we want to make sure that everybody's question is answered and that no question is too big or too small to be answered. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So first, I would like to introduce Victor. Victor is an analyst for the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. He received his BS in nuclear engineering from Texas A&M and brings an experience from NASA, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and the Comanche Peak Nuclear Power Plant before joining the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. He spent his time working as a health physicist for the UT Health Science Center in Houston, Texas, where he focused on using his background in radiological science to protect people and the environment from the potential hazards of radiation. He also brings in nuclear science and technology policy experience by having previously served as chair for the Nuclear Texas Engineering Student Delegation and as a delegate for the U.S. Nuclear Engineering Student Delegation. I hope I got all that right, Victor. Very sorry if I didn't. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our second presenter, and then we'll go ahead and get started with your presentation, Victor. So our second presenter today is John Kotek. He is the Senior Vice President for Policy Development and Public Affairs at the Nuclear Energy Institute. He's responsible for providing policy and public affairs leadership on economic electricity market and environmental issues related to the nuclear energy industry. John was appointed in January 2015 to the position of Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Nuclear Energy and was nominated by President Obama in October 2015 to serve as Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy. In that role, he was responsible for DOE's research efforts on current and future nuclear energy systems, maintaining the government's nuclear energy research infrastructure, establishing a path forward for the nation's spent nuclear fuel and high-level nuclear waste management programs, and is the host of other national priorities. So two very qualified gentlemen to talk about nuclear energy, so we're excited to have you here today. I'm going to stop sharing, and then Victor, we're going to hear from you first, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to have you share your screen, and we are going to take it away. Again, folks who just joined us, if you want to put your name and your affiliation in the chat, and then we will also be taking questions in the chat. And also, if you wanted to, that will be later after our presentations. We'll be doing question and answer then. So, all right, Victor, whenever you are ready. And Victor, you're on mute. There you go.
Screen. Okay, sweet. Can everyone hear me? Sound check, screen check, everything going well?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect. Let me get started then. All right. So thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you for that great introduction, Kim. So like Kim was saying, my name is Victor Ibarra. I'm an analyst for the NIA, and I'll be giving a brief introduction into advanced nuclear energy. So without further ado, let me start by first going over who the Nuclear Innovation Alliance is. So just a quick background on us. We're a nonprofit think and do tank based out here in Washington, D.C., working to ensure that advanced nuclear energy is part of the climate solution moving forward. And we do this through a variety of ways, including performing our own analyses, identifying barriers, and engaging stakeholders, whether that's advanced reactor developers or companies themselves, or even engaging with a lot of local, state, and federal level policymakers. So here on the screen, we have my boss, Judy, who pays or signs off on my paychecks. We have Alex and Patrick, who are both project managers. Me, I've been with the NIA for about 8 months now. And then we have two fellows, River and Megan, who are part of our day-to-day activities. So without further ado, let's get into nuclear energy. This is the reason why you're here. So let's talk a little bit about what nuclear fission is and how does it relate to, or how does it work? So nuclear fission is the process of splitting a large atom into two or smaller ones. And that's just the general basic idea I want to get across. Obviously, there's different or a lot more details associated with that. But the main idea I want to draw from that is that there's a lot of energy released through this process of fission. And a lot of smart people figured out a few decades ago that they could harness or engineer a way to control this energy and use it to produce electricity. So on the next slide, I have a basic 101 briefing of how a nuclear power plant works. And if you're not familiar with a lot of the thermal power plants that exist in the United States today or across the globe, they all operate pretty similarly. A nuclear power plant is kind of just like a coal plant in the fact that they produce electricity by boiling water, which produces steam. That steam is then used to spin a turbine, and that turbine then produces electricity, which is what powering my laptop today, what's powering your laptops at home, your cell phones, and what we use in our everyday life. So this is also a pretty fascinating concept to explain to either, if you have kids in grade school right now, what the different transitions of energy look like. So we have nuclear energy being converted into thermal energy, to mechanical energy and electrical energy. So it's all very, very fascinating. And as you can see here on the graph on the right, from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we have a simple schematic of how a conventional nuclear power plant operates today. So why nuclear energy? Why do we care about this, and what does it do for us? So nuclear energy is extremely firm, it's clean, it produces zero carbon emissions, and it is extremely, extremely dense. And why is this so important? As Kim was saying, I used to work in Houston, and when I lived in Houston, we experienced a variety of natural disasters such as hurricanes. We experienced the Texas freeze as most recently as February. And when we're talking about climate mitigation or addressing climate change going into the future, we really need to make sure that we have all the disposable tools at our belt, and we include all type of technologies moving forward when it comes to securing a very broad energy portfolio. So we want to make sure that nuclear energy is included because it checks off a lot of the boxes, which is that it produces zero carbon emissions. It is firm, which means that it can be paired with variable energy sources like solar or wind whenever they're not producing electricity to back them up. And like I said, it's extremely, extremely dense. So advanced nuclear energy is a very, very broad term. So on this pictures here on this slide, I have kind of broken down what type of technologies that we are looking at the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. We have different types of technologies that range from advanced light water reactors to high temperature gas reactors, molten salt reactors, sodium cooled fast reactors. There's a lot of different types of technologies that are currently being pursued and developed here in the United States and globally, which is really, really exciting because there's a lot of pros to each type of technology. And the primary reason why people and communities and even policymakers are taking a second look at advanced nuclear technology or nuclear technology in general is because of the fact that it addresses a few of the concerns that people may have had previously about nuclear energy. People consider nuclear energy not to be safe, and that's not what we believe to be true. We believe nuclear energy is extremely, extremely safe. And this is further addressed by the fact that advanced nuclear energy wants to even make nuclear even safer than it already is. So it does that by changing kind of the fundamental way a nuclear power plant operates by transitioning from either active safety systems to inherent safety systems, which essentially means that they rely more on the laws of physics to ensure that whenever a reactor has to go into shutdown mode, it does it without any human input and does it essentially by itself, which is really a marvelous type of engineering. And it also reduces the amount of nuclear material associated with the plant. So, we have reactors that used to be extremely large, but now we're looking at reactors that may be a lot smaller. And because it's a lot smaller, there's a smaller amount of nuclear fuel associated with it, so smaller inherent hazard. We'll also be using new types of fuel forms, whether it's, advancements in technologies that have already existed from the 60s, like what was triso fuel or used to be biso fuel. And we will also be changing kind of the way we think about siting reactors in the future, because they will be potentially smaller. We will now be thinking about areas that we may not have thought about previously in terms of how we site them or where we locate them. So this, paired with the fact that advanced nuclear technologies have a unique capability to decarbonize multiple sectors, is really making people take a second look at advanced nuclear energy. So advanced nuclear energy can not only be just used for electricity, but it can be used for potentially district heating. It could be used for co-production of hydrogen, which is really hot topic right now in the Department of Energy here in the United States, and even globally in countries like, or not countries, but in entities like the European Union. It could also be used to potentially decarbonize the transportation sector, whether it comes to even just like vehicles here in the United States, as in cars, but even maritime or boats in the ocean. It could heat homes. It could decarbonize parts of other industrial economic sectors. Like it could be used to power steel or cement making associated practices. And it's just a really versatile way to decarbonize a lot of the economies that exist nowadays in the United States. So when you put all of these together, it's just a very exciting time to look at advanced nuclear energy. So now I just want to take a little step back and kind of compare about what advanced nuclear energy is compared to conventional nuclear energy. So on the left side of this table, we have kind of the characteristics that are associated with a lot of conventional nuclear energy, which is primarily the fact that they're a little bit larger reactor sizes. They are more than 1,000 megawatts electric in size. They're predominantly associated with one type of technology, which is light water reactor technology. And they're primarily baseload generation sources, which means that they operate at 100% of the time for, continuously for about 18-month cycles primarily, depending on if they're pressurized water reactor, boiling water reactor. But this is extremely important because of the fact of that we are currently increasing our reliance, or we are expanding our energy portfolio in terms of how much renewable energy we have in it. So this is really important because of the fact that the more renewable energy that we produce or that we create, we need to make sure that we back it up with either an energy storage system, or we back it up with something firm like nuclear energy, which is why conventional nuclear is really cool. And then these systems are primarily designed with active safety systems and exclusively use LEU fuel rods. But now on the right, we can see that advanced nuclear energy, even though it's the same type of technology, it's radically different in terms of how it's expected to be sized. We have designs that are ranging from 1.5 megawatt electric to up to 300 megawatt electric in size, which as you can see is a huge difference. We have that wide variety of reactor technologies, whether it's molten salt reactors, sodium cooled fast reactors, even advanced light water reactors. It's really cool to have all these type of different engineering designs being developed here in the United States. And one of the bigger differences with the advanced nuclear technology designs is that they will be either created to operate on a grid, kind of like what the current conventional nuclear reactor looks like, but they also will be incorporated into potentially smaller or even smart grids, or be dispatchable in the sense that they can be paired in or be located in remote locations like Alaska or in smaller rural communities, and can be even used potentially in emergency response situations. Like I said, I came from, or before I moved here to DC, I used to live in Houston, where we were affected by The hurricanes were affected by the winter freeze, and getting power to communities sometimes are hit by disasters is really, really important. So that's also another application of nuclear energy. Advanced nuclear energy will also, like I said, be designed with inherent safety systems and will also have a variety of different types of fuels. So going to the next slide, it is a very emerging industry. Well, here in the US, or it's an emerging industry for US competitiveness, because as this map shows here, we have a lot of ongoing activity that exists throughout the entirety of the United States for the advanced nuclear energy community. So we have from up in Washington all the way down to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We have different companies, different laboratories, different supply chain and management stakeholders associated with the advanced nuclear energy supply chain. And they are doing really, really great work. So it's an exciting time for advanced nuclear energy here in the United States. So what does this timeline look like? So, because of a lot of the bipartisan efforts that have occurred in Congress over the past couple of years, and because of what's going on now, there will be a few demonstration projects under the Advanced Reactor Development Project that will occur in the late 2020s. For those of you that do not know about the Advanced Reactor demonstration projects, they are essentially award winners that will be able to demonstrate their technology. The two current demo winners are X Energy and TerraPower, and they will be demonstrating their reactors in the late 2020s. So hopefully through those demonstrations, we'll learn a lot from their technology and eventually be able to fully commercialize advanced nuclear reactor technology by the 2030s and 2040s, which is really, really cool, because regardless of, well, at least personal opinion, right? Regardless of, what you think the timeline is for, certain type of technologies, our energy demands are still projected to keep growing. So the more clean energy that we can add in the future, the better it will be for us if we're trying to meet deep decarbonization goals. So just to tie this back and finish up my presentation, how is NIA involved in nuclear advanced innovation? Like I said, we do this by doing our own analysis. So here are a couple of highlights of our analysis. So we quantify tax policies for new advanced reactor builds. So, we have our own models that show what certain tax credits could do for advanced nuclear energy and how that would help with deploying them in the future. We are trying to reimagine new advanced reactor regulations. So for those of you that don't know, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a regulatory body that oversees nuclear power plant or nuclear facilities here in the United States. So we're trying to see what we can do there to make sure that we implement nuclear reactors in the future or commercialize them still in a safe way, but potentially in a more efficient way. And without cutting too much into John's time, I think that covers some of the things that we're doing right now. I can share these slides, or if you see anything that jumps out here, we can talk about it, but I think that covers most of it. And then here are two reports that we just put out. We put out a primer on advanced reactor technology that we released on September 1st. So for those of you that may be new to nuclear in general, or maybe want to refresh on some of what's going on here in the United States and in Canada, that'd be a good read. And then we also released last week Advanced Reactors for State Policymakers, which is a brief that essentially overgoes some case studies and what's going on in the United States that has made advanced nuclear reactors so attractive. So it's really, really cool because we go over case studies that involve Puerto Rico, Wyoming, Idaho Falls, and I did already mention Wyoming, right? So we have a few case studies that oversee what is going on in the United States. So it's really, really cool time to be involved in nuclear. So I believe that sums up what I had. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or any of my colleagues, or feel free to follow up on our website. So that should
Thanks,
be
Victor. That was fantastic. Really good basic overview, which is really helpful because not everybody on the call has a good understanding about just what the basics of nuclear are. So we will include those reports in the follow-up email that we're going to send out for folks. And then we'll also include the contact information that you had, and then the slides as well. So if folks have want to go refer back to the slides, that will be in the follow-up email for folks. So I'm going to have you stop sharing your screen, and
Cool.
I'm going to welcome John Kotek to the floor. And John, you're more than welcome to start sharing your screen for your presentation. Thank you, everybody who just joined us. My name is Kim Alexander. I'm one of the directors of Bethesda Green. We're a nonprofit based in Bethesda, Maryland. We are doing introductions and affiliations in the chat. So if you've not put your name and your affiliation in the chat, that would be great. And then we're also doing questions in the chat. So we'll do questions after John is finished. So make sure to include your questions in the chat then. Okay, John, whenever you're ready.
Fantastic. Now, thank you, Kim. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to talk to you a little bit today about why is it you're hearing so much about nuclear? Why is it that political leaders across the spectrum, whether it's the current administration, the Republican leadership on the Hill, members of the media, prominent NGOs, labor groups, energy policy analysts, and others are all coming to the conclusion that nuclear energy has an important role to play, both today and in the future, in getting us to a deeply decarbonized energy system. What you're seeing, if you've sort of noticed more conversation about nuclear, you're absolutely right. Right? It's very high on the agenda right now, particularly as we engage with policymakers and energy decision makers in the utility industries that are going to have to actually deploy the technologies to get us to a decarbonized grid and beyond. Just a little bit about us as NEI. It's the Nuclear Energy Industries Trade Association here in DC. We've got more than 300 members across 15 countries. As an organization, we've embraced a vision of a world powered by clean and reliable energy, and we see our role in achieving that vision is to promote the use and growth of nuclear energy through both efficient operations and effective policies. Just a little more about kind of the current state of play here in the US. Currently, we've got 93 reactors at 54 plant sites across the United States, including a couple of reactors operate here in the state of Maryland, where I'm based. I'm speaking to you from North Bethesda. Across the country, most of the reactors are concentrated, in the Northeast, Southeast, and in the Midwest. All told, nuclear provides almost 20% of the electricity in the US. In fact, is now the second largest source of electricity in the United States as we see the continued contraction of coal. If you look just at those emissions-free sources of generation, nuclear represents more than half of the emissions-free generation we have here in the United States, and that's true worldwide too. If you look at low carbon electricity generation in advanced economies around the world, nuclear is the largest source. If you look at all economies around the world, nuclear is second to hydropower. There was a question I saw asked in the chat by Paul Gunter. Paul, it's good to see you again. Pardon me while I go back to this one. Asking about the life cycle emissions of carbon across, and I'm sorry, there's apparently an animation in here that shouldn't be. If you look across the full life cycle, while nuclear and other technologies have emissions-free generation, there is this question of, well, what are the carbon emissions from the full life cycle? If you look at the IPCC reports, you'll find that those reports find, I'll go back to it again, although it's going to change on me. Nuclear is right down there with onshore and offshore wind in terms of total carbon emissions intensity per unit of electricity generated. All energy technologies come with some carbon emissions from mining, from manufacturing, from construction, what have you. But to underscore Paul's point, nuclear is very low when you look at the full life cycle. When you think about what it's going to take to decarbonize the grid, there's been some really important work done in recent years that have helped people put their finger on why nuclear is so important. So this is a really groundbreaking study from a couple of years ago out of MIT that looked at how do you what is it going to cost to fully decarbonize the electric grid? And what the chart on the left is showing is if you just try to do it using what they call fuel saving technology. So think of technologies without a fuel like wind and solar, plus what they call fast burst, which is storage technology that can respond to short-term fluctuations in the grid. It's going to cost you anywhere from 10 to 62% more to get to zero than if you include this third piece of the pie, firm low carbon generation. Now, today, what that means is nuclear power. That is the proven source of firm low carbon generation we have. In the future, that could include gas with carbon capture, could include very long duration storage, deep geothermal. To be sure, there are other technologies that fill that role. But right now, the one that has been proven at scale, at the necessary scale to decarbonize right now is nuclear energy. Another reason you're seeing nuclear so high on the public policy agenda is because if you listen to President Biden, he says when he thinks clean energy, he thinks jobs. Well, the best paying jobs in the energy sector are in nuclear, all right? And nuclear also happens to be very highly unionized and more diverse than other parts of the electric generation sector, all leading nuclear to be very strongly embraced, particularly by our nation's labor unions, which are committed to ensuring that this transition to a clean energy economy also results in the creation of long-term, well-paying jobs in that industry, and nuclear is top of the list. That's why we enjoy so much support. As you look at the map of where decarbonization is occurring in the United States, even absent a federal policy or federal law requiring decarbonization, we're seeing more and more utilities embracing the importance of getting to zero carbon. This shows a map of service territories served by those utilities that have made pledges to deeply or even fully decarbonize by 2050 or sooner. You'll see it's something on the order of 3/4 of all customers in the US are now served by a utility that has such a pledge. One of the things you'll notice about those utilities that have those pledges is actually most of them operate nuclear power plants. That's the ones in blue here operate nuclear plants. And we're counting on them to carry the lion's share of the pledged carbon reductions out through mid-century. What those utilities are finding is the same thing that those earlier studies I pointed to found, which is having firm zero carbon generation to go along with rising shares of wind and solar and storage is the fastest way to an affordable, reliable, decarbonized grid. So step one in getting to a low carbon grid and low carbon energy system is to keep what we've got. Extend the lifetimes of today's nuclear reactors. So as you may know, today's reactors were initially licensed to operate for 40 years. Almost all in the US have been approved to operate out to 60, and we've got several that have been approved to operate out to 80, with many more under consideration. So our utilities are pursuing retention of existing nuclear as job one in meeting their decarbonization goals. The second thing they're looking at is the role that firm clean generation can play and must play in fully decarbonizing the grid, in doing so in a way that leaves you with an affordable, reliable system. So I like to show this chart, series of charts from a study that was done by a group called E3 on behalf of a company called Energy Northwest, which runs the Columbia Generating Station, a nuclear plant out in Washington State. What they found is that as you try to get to 100% carbon-free, even with all the legacy hydro that exists out in the Pacific Northwest, there's huge value in having both today's CGS, the Columbia Generating Station, this chart on the right, as well as having SMR, small modular reactors. In fact, what this study found was in decarbonizing the electric grid in the Northwest. So this looked beyond just Washington State in its law to decarbonize by 2045. It looked at Washington, Oregon, and parts of Idaho and Montana. You can get the grid to zero carbon for about $8 billion a year less with small modular reactors and by keeping existing nuclear than if you try to do it with just renewables and storage alone. Huge benefits from having firm, clean generation on the system. The reason is you don't have to overbuild wind, solar. You don't have to have the transmission lines over very long distances to tie all those things together, that you would otherwise have to have if you tried to decarbonize the grid just using intermittent variable generation from things like wind and solar. So huge cost benefits to be realized by having firm clean generation on the grid. That's leading a lot of utility companies to look hard at not just keeping today's reactors, but actually adding more. So companies like Xcel and Dominion that currently operate nuclear plants, companies like Idaho Power, which don't, but have a new nuclear plant planned for their neighborhood out at the Idaho National Laboratory. These companies and many more are now looking seriously at next generation nuclear as having a role to play in getting to that affordable, reliable, decarbonized grid. Also want to remind folks that when you talk about decarbonizing our economy, as the president wants to do by 2050, that goes way beyond the grid. Right? Only somewhere between a quarter and a third of emissions in the US and worldwide are associated with electricity production. When you look at things like transportation, industrial applications, agriculture, other energy end uses, you've got a lot of use of fossil fuels in there that are going to be, in some cases, very difficult to decarbonize using renewables alone. Having a source of high temperature process heat, for example, to help decarbonize things like iron and steel or concrete production can make a huge difference in trying to decarbonize some of these difficult to decarbonize energy end use sectors. That's another reason that's driving interest in new nuclear. And so, as we look at today, where the focus has been pretty much on decarbonizing the grid, and to a certain extent, electrify as much as you can. Things like light vehicle transport can and should be electrified. And the move to electric vehicles, I think, is going to only accelerate in the coming decades. But there's still a lot of things, a lot of energy end uses that are going to require something other than electricity, and we think nuclear has a big role to play there. And this is just an example of some of the operating temperature ranges of some of the processes that could potentially be decarbonized using a next generation of reactor systems. Certainly not every energy end use right now, but some important ones you can help to clean up using nuclear. The last thing I'll mention before we turn to questions, well, two things. One is that there's a potentially very large market for new nuclear globally. And if you think about, if you can develop a nuclear energy system that can compete and win in the United States market, that can do very, very well globally. And as other nations seek to decarbonize, what we found is that you're going to see roughly a doubling of nuclear energy capacity around the world between now and 2050. And we think US companies can capture somewhere between 1.3 and 1.9 trillion of that market. It's going to be a huge market. Of course, the clean energy market writ large is going to be many, many tens of trillions of dollars around the world. But there's a huge opportunity to, again, create good paying long-term jobs in the US economy by competing and winning in civil nuclear export markets. One last point I think is important to make is, you're going to hear people criticizing nuclear, and certainly I saw in the chat, the waste issue has been raised. I can talk about that here in a minute as we get into the Q&A. Folks will talk about costs, they'll talk about other challenges. As you're engaging in this conversation and studying alternatives as to what it's going to take to decarbonize, always ask the question, compared to what? It's easy to pick on any one of these technologies and find things to not like about them, right? Whether it's land use, whether it's mining requirements, whether it's the need for long distance transmission lines, right? Every energy technology has a downside. Nuclear does, so do the rest of them. If you, as this study does, if you decide you're going to rule out new nuclear and you're going to try to do the whole job to decarbonize the grid using just renewables alone, look at the difference in terms of onshore wind, solar PV, and long distance transmission that will have to be built to get there. Okay, I'm not saying that building 10,000 megawatts of new nuclear each year over the over the next several decades is going to be easy. It's going to be a challenge. So are all of these other things too. So as you're thinking about the challenges before us, we've never scaled clean energy at the rate we're going to need to scale if we're going to decarbonize our grid by 2035 and if we're going to decarbonize the economy by 2050. It's going to take every tool we have in the low carbon toolkit. Nuclear energy has an important role to play now and has, in my view, an even more important role to play in the future in helping us get to that affordable, reliable, decarbonized grid and decarbonized energy economy of the future. So let me leave it at that for my presentation. But Kim, I did see in the chat that there was a question about the waste issue.
Yeah, do you mind if we come back to that? Would that be okay?
By all means, in whatever
great.
order you'd like. I do have some images I can show that help, but I can stop sharing and then start again later if that works for you.
Yeah, let's do that. Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. So what I'd like to do now is address a couple of the questions in the chat that just go over some basic things about nuclear. Again, not everybody on this call has the same understanding of nuclear.
Yep.
So I'd like to get to some of the more basic questions first so that everybody's on the same page. So Victor, I'm wondering if you could talk about how long it takes to build a nuclear plant.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Back when reactors were first expanding here in the United States, some project timelines range from anywhere from 7, 8, 9 to 10 years. Because of the fact that the United States stopped building a lot of nuclear power plants for a few decades, we've lost a lot of the construction and knowledge associated with building a nuclear power plant. So as you can see now with some of the ongoing projects, maybe at Vogtle, they're taking a little bit longer than what they were originally projected to. So it's I think reached above 10 years at this point, and hopefully will come into operation in early of 2022, so next year in a few months. But the thought process, especially with advanced nuclear technologies or advanced nuclear reactors, is because they'll be smaller in size in terms of megawatt output. So they'll take shorter timelines to be built. How quickly can we build these is up in the air, primarily because of the fact, like I said, we lost a lot of the expertise associated with construction, but the thought process is because we will hopefully start building more reactors. And part of the reason why advanced nuclear technology is really interesting as well is because some of these reactor designs will actually be built modularly. So by modularly, I mean kind of like in Lego brick style, where you can build pieces and parts of the reactor, ship them to the reactor site, and then put them together, which will eventually, through lessons learned, lead to shorter construction time. So, I want to give you an exact number, but because of the fact that they haven't been built yet, I can't really give you an exact one. So hopefully that is a satisfying answer.
Yeah, I think that was great. Thanks.
Mhm.
So another question that I'd like to throw to you is there an alternative to uranium?
Yeah, so currently most of the advanced reactor designs are going to still be priced or based on uranium. And from my mindset, there's been a lot of recent discoveries in the past few decades of uranium reserves. So I don't think any type of worry should be had in terms of how much uranium we will have to go around potentially. But maybe John has a little bit more insight into that. John, do you have any?
Well, if you're talking about alternatives to uranium, I mean, certainly there are people looking at thorium fuel cycles. There are also reactors around the world that run on recycled fuel. I would just caution people to buy into this idea that uranium is somehow limited in the short term. It's not. A big part of the reason why you'll see, if you look at sort of global reserves of uranium, it won't look like there's that much runway, in terms of if you had a big expansion of nuclear. But that's because prices have been so low, there hasn't been a lot of exploration. Uranium is very abundant. Heck, you can get it out of seawater. We were running a program when I was at DOE to show that you can get uranium out of seawater it would probably double the cost of the nuclear fuel, but nuclear fuel is only 10% of the cost of running a nuclear power plant anyway. So it's that, folks will raise that as a reason not to pursue nuclear. If you're worried about mining and resource availability, things like rare earth elements for wind turbines, you get into cobalt mining for EVs. I mean, as soon as you start digging into the mining issue, no pun intended, you're going to find a whole lot of other things to be concerned about that will make uranium availability look pale in comparison.
Great, thank you. And just one other question on basics that I saw in the chat. So could either of you talk about the materials to keep salt eating through contaminant? Not sure. Talking about saltwater intrusion. Is that something either of you can talk about?
Was that a reference to molten salt reactor technology?
Yes, yeah.
I think it might have been a molten salt. Yeah, no, that's certainly one of the challenges going from a water-cooled system to a molten salt-cooled system is going to be you have to qualify a different set of materials. So that'll be an important part of proving to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that a reactor like that can be designed, built, and operated safely. I know some of the people who are working on this. I'm confident that they've identified alloys that they can bring to the NRC and make that safety case. Because frankly, they're very well along in their licensing efforts with the NRC. So I'm confident that's done. I can't quote you specifically what alloy they've chosen for that application, but I know the issue has been identified as being addressed.
Right, fantastic. So another question was, why don't we talk about waste now? So John, do you want to bring up your slides on waste?
Yeah, and I can do that. I think it was Paul that raised that. I got to give Paul some credit. I think, Paul, you were one of the founders of the Clamshell Alliance back in the Seabrook days. And for those who don't know it, there was an effort to stop the Seabrook nuclear power plant from in New Hampshire from starting up by getting the state of Massachusetts to object to its startup. That actually put nuclear energy on the agenda in my high school physics class, and it's part of the reason I'm a nuclear engineer now. So Paul gets some credit for me being here. On the waste issue, let me pull some slide up here.
Real quick, while you're pulling that up, do either you or Victor want to talk about what nuclear waste is so that we have a good working understanding of what it is?
Well, here, so bear with me.
Yeah.
Here's a picture. I got a few pictures. All right. So just so folks know, so when we talk about, God darn it, I'm sorry, there's some animation in this. I'm going to have to not show it in full screen mode. So when we talk about uranium fuel, this is today's reactors. Some of the newer ones are very different, but this is what we run here in Maryland, for example. All right, so the fuel pellet you see being held there, it's about the size of the tip of your finger. That's uranium oxide. That's a hard ceramic. Okay, that gets stacked in these long metal tubes here. We call that fuel cladding, and that fits into this thing called the fuel assembly. Now, depending on the reactor design, there can be somewhere from 200 to 500 of these assemblies in a reactor core. They're all a little different. Okay, those stay in a reactor for about 5 years. Okay. After they are taken out of the reactor, they are both very thermally and radioactively hot. So they need to be shielded and cooled. So they go into one of these pools you see on the left. Every reactor site has one. And the fuel will stay in there for some period of time. In the US, they tend to stay in there for decades. In other countries, they move them out faster. But ultimately, all of this material will wind up in dry storage casks. So you see one here. This is a big, 18-foot, give or take, tall concrete and steel cask that is air cooled, and it sits on a concrete pad, right? And that's where the fuel goes. And as an example, right, here's the Connecticut Yankee reactor. Ran for almost 30 years. At the end of the reactor's gone. It's been shut down for years. All the spent fuel has been put into these casks, and there it sits. Now, the downside is we were supposed to have a repository developed to serve as a final resting place for this fuel decades ago. When I was at DOE last time around, I ran the federal effort to try and get a program started again, because A decision had been made back in 2010 that we weren't going to go forward with the plan that we had, which was to develop a repository at a place called Yucca Mountain in Nevada. Congress has not been able to agree on a new path forward. And so in the meantime, the material sits there. Now, this is a pad about the size of a hockey rink. Okay? They have to provide, guards and surveillance around this material to ensure that, the material stays safe where it is. If you look at the trade-off, if you had generated the same amount of electricity using natural gas instead of the spent fuel that you see sitting here, you would generate enough carbon dioxide to fill the Superdome more than 3,000 times. Okay, nuclear has played a huge role in keeping the amount of carbon in the atmosphere frankly to the level it's at now, which is still unacceptably high, but we've kept about 2 years worth of global carbon emissions out of the atmosphere by generating material like this. Yes, we need to find a long-term solution to this problem. Other nations are far ahead of us in that regard. It's not a technical issue, it's become a socio-political issue. But in the near term, this material is not difficult to manage safely until we do find that solution. Victor, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, so I think I also see Paul adding a little bit more information or some comments in the chat. So one important thing that I also want to point out is that there's different classifications of waste. There's the fuel waste that we are attempting to find a permanent solution for here in the United States. And there's ongoing efforts internationally that may serve as case studies that may give us insight into what a permanent geological repository may look like for the United States here in the future, like the Onkolo geological repository site. Is that in Finland, John? Is that you?
Yeah, Onkolo is in Finland, yes.
Yeah, so I believe they're the first, or at least the most recent country to begin a program similar to that. And going off of just different types of nuclear waste, so we were talking about specifically fuel waste, but there's also different categories of of nuclear waste. There's Class A waste, there's Class B waste, there's Class C waste that are produced at different varying levels and can be treated and or disposed of differently than reactor fuel, essentially. So, in Texas, we have a low-level waste repository site where they treat and handle a lot of nuclear waste. And even at the hospital I used to work at in Houston, I would deal with nuclear waste literally 4 or 5 times a day, pick it up from where they were using it in the laboratory site, and then take it where it needed to be at least held until, a waste solutions entity would pick it up, and then they would take it to the repository site where it would either be treated or disposed of. So, it's also important to know that, there's different levels of waste and classification systems associated with nuclear waste. So thanks for Paul for bringing that up.
Excellent. Okay. Anything more about waste that we want to talk about? No? Okay. So one of the other questions that was in the chat is, can you talk, John, you mentioned it a little bit when you were talking about Yankee Power Plant, which was, by the way, was 20 minutes from where I grew up. So I'm very familiar with that site. Could you talk a little bit more about the safety issues that surround nuclear?
Yeah, sure. And one of the things that is really great about this next generation of nuclear technologies is we now have 60 years of operating experience to work from, right? I mean, when you think about things like the 3 Mile Island accident here in the U.S. in the late 70s, that was comparatively very early days for the technology. Chernobyl was Chernobyl, and that was a reactor design you could never get licensed, could never operate in the United States. But you look at even what happened to Fukushima in Japan 10 years ago, there were learnings from that about the importance of having offsite power and assured reliable backup power systems, for example, that are getting built into this next generation of technologies. And so what the designers are doing is, in recognition of what they've learned over those 60 years, they're designing systems that rely much more on what we call passive safety features, things that don't require operator action. So very large heat sinks, for example, in the case of the NuScale reactor technology. You know, what happened at Fukushima in Japan at the end of the day was you lost the ability to cool the fuel in the reactor core. What NuScale does is it provides a very large pool of water to serve as a heat sink, so that you've got a place for the heat to go from that nuclear fuel, and so it doesn't overheat and melt. Okay. Other technologies use different approaches, right? Where they have coolants, for example, that can again hold a lot of heat, or they've got fuel designs that it requires much higher temperatures to get to melt that fuel. Because at the end of the day, when you get down to nuclear safety, a lot of it's just about protecting the fuel and make sure the fuel stays intact, because the source of the radioactive material that you don't want to get out, that's in the nuclear fuel. That's when the nuclear fuel splits, the uranium splits or fissions, that's where you get the highly radioactive materials. Keep that stuff in place in the reactor core as it should be, and you know, you've addressed a lot of what's required by nuclear safety. Victor, what would you add to that?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I think you covered it pretty well, John. I mean, what was the exact specific question again? Just why are advanced reactors so safe, or?
We're talking about safety issues.
Yeah. So a lot of these advanced reactor systems, I think John covered it perfectly. They will just be transitioning into more inherent safety features, which will be associated with less human input, which, as John has already pointed out, the worst accident we've had here in the United States was very early into the nuclear industry. I think it was only, 20 years into fission, 30 years into fission technology being fully understood at that point. And now, like John says, we have over 60 years of experience operating nuclear reactors here in the United States. And any reactor that is going to be constructed or even begin construction here in the United States will have to essentially prove that they're just as safe as the current light water reactors that are operating here in the United States, right? So I think advanced reactors will be equally, if not even more safe, because like I also said earlier in the presentation, they're incorporating these new types of, or kind of like paradigm shifts into how they're reimagining nuclear technology. I mentioned TRISO fuel, which is a fuel form that will be able to contain any fission products, which is any, gas effluents that are created or emitted in the fission process. So, it's just little things like that that will make everything a lot, in my opinion, safer for advanced nuclear energy to be deployed here in the United States and globally.
Yeah, fantastic.
Kim, I see Paul is downloading his latest talking points into the chat. So I think maybe I should hit this one about sustainability and the cost of nuclear.
I was actually going to ask you Paul's question about the Price-Anderson Act. I don't know what this is.
Oh, yeah. So
do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, the Price-Anderson Act actually goes back to the early days of nuclear power. It's a framework that was set up in the early days of nuclear to ensure that there are adequate indemnity provisions in place to ensure that if there is a nuclear accident, that the industry holds enough insurance and that there's clarity on who's going to be responsible for picking up the rest of the responsibility to ensure that you can compensate the public in the event of a nuclear incident. So it's something that has actually been proven to work. The government's actually never paid any money out in the 60+ year history of the Price-Anderson Act, but it's something that's been in place for a long time. On the issue of cost, I've got to respond to this one that Paul raises, because he raises an important question about the state level policies that have been put in place to ensure that we don't shut down any more well-run nuclear plants. You may have seen the state of Illinois, for example, recently passed a law that includes support that is going to allow the state's 11 nuclear reactors to stay in operation. What's happened is you've got two types of electricity markets in the United States. roughly half the country is still traditional cost of service regulation, where the utility, bills essentially the ratepayers for whatever it costs to provide that service, plus a rate of return that's set by a state public utility commission. The other half is deregulated markets, where you have nuclear plants and other providers competing to sell electricity, all right? And they get dispatched based on lowest cost. Because nuclear plants run 24/7, they don't actually bid into those markets. They actually just take whatever the market gives them. And in an increasing number of cases, the market has not delivered enough revenue to cover the cost of running the nuclear plant. Now, the average nuclear plant only costs 3 cents a kilowatt hour to run in the US. They're actually very, very affordable. The issue is natural gas is even cheaper, all right? And so what Paul is saying is that Paul is apparently okay with carbon emitting natural gas undercutting carbon-free nuclear in those markets, right? What the states have done is the states have said, we value that zero carbon attribute, and we are going to give those plants the revenue they need to keep running and not shut down and not cause us to go backward in meeting our state carbon commitments, right? So I think the point that Paul is making is an important one. It's essential that we keep our nuclear plants running. And if it requires a little extra incentive, we already provide a lot of incentive for wind and solar, both federal tax credits and state level renewable energy credits. In fact, the average wind farm makes most of its money from policy, not from electricity sales. Okay, and that's fine. We need more low carbon electricity on the grid, and I'm fine with us providing incentives for other forms of zero carbon generation. We need to do that for nuclear too. The federal government needs to step up and make that happen, but until they do, the states have taken action to ensure that we keep our carbon emissions down, and bravo to them for doing it.
All right. Well, thank you for all your thoughtful comments. Those are great.
You can tell Paul and I can go on for hours.
Yeah, it sounds like a really great debate. So it is 5:30, and John sounds like he has a dog in the background that needs to have dinner.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. So I wanted to thank our speakers for being here tonight. I really appreciate your time, and thank you to everybody who attended this evening. We will have a follow-up email going out with a recording of this session and then all of the resources that were mentioned during the session today. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to our speakers, and I will wish everybody a good night and have a good evening. Thank you. Have a
Thanks,
wonderful
everyone.
evening.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Yeah.